Resident Evil has been a household name for the past 20 years in the video game landscape. Cited as the franchise that coined the term survival horror, this series has struck fear into the hearts of many. That fear could be either for the better in terms of an amazing pulse-pounding thrill ride with the relentless pursuer in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, or it could be for the worse with the overhyped, nonsensical slog that was Resident Evil 6. Either way you slice it, there was a crisis between multiple iterations of Resident Evil. Mainly, this involved an identity crisis that began well after Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 took the franchise into a status of critical acclaim. Some reviewers even cited this game to be one of the best third-person shooters of all time. However, it wasn't akin to your typical Resident Evil formula. Survival horror as we knew it was long gone in favor of mass weapon drops, taking Spaniards right to Suplex City, and using gold to upgrade your tools of destruction.
Got a selection of good things on sale, stranger.
Several years later, as Resident Evil shifted genres from horror to pure action and mostly online spin-offs, the more recent entry in the series, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, supposedly takes the regurgitated statement of going back to roots again with this new mainline entry. There's one thing that I've always wondered, one thing that has always been in the back of my mind ever since Resident Evil 6 concluded. How will this series end? It's not even surprising that this notion seems self-referential even to the characters themselves in the core Resident Evil story.
I can't let this war follow me forever. More and more I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for.
Hey Chris, how much longer can we keep going on like this?
Too old for this shit.
I'm going to personally break this video up into 5 segments of how I think Resident Evil should end on the 8th installment. These segments will include story, characters, gameplay mechanics, themes, and miscellaneous concepts, all numbered in order from 1 to 5. There definitely will be time codes for the sake of your convenience, so be sure to utilize that wisely down in the comments below. Let's once again enter the world of survival horror. I'd like to also preface and say that nothing has been confirmed about Resident Evil 8 other than the fact that it's supposedly in production, along with Shinji Mikami saying that maybe he will come back and work on another Resident Evil project. This video is just meant for discussion and assumption regarding the things that I want for Resident Evil 8. If it sounds like overglorified fanfiction in certain parts, that's because, well, it is. So don't take this video seriously as a valid source of information. Nothing is official until Capcom says so. I believe the story still should center around a gigantic viral outbreak. This usually serves as a catalyst for all the events that happen in the Resident Evil mythos, except this time a chemical warfare outbreak in the beginning of the game is actually successful, as opposed to the heroes always stopping it, leaving a stark and grim reminder on the player as New York City and Washington DC begins to collapse in the midst of a new apocalypse. The year is 2020 and the game should take place 3 years after the events of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. The story should gradually finish up the arcs that were created with Resident Evil 6, Vendetta, and Revelations 2 as a 19-year-old Natalia Corda, aka mind-swapped Alex Wesker, begins her plan to finish what her brother started with a global infection. I would say that before Natalia's mission commences, she would need to cut ties with her humanity. So the first casualty would be at the Burton residence, where she shoots her stepmom, Kathy Burton, right in the head. Barry Burton turns around, draws his weapon. Natalia opens fire, shooting him twice in the chest, leaving Barry Burton critically wounded. I believe that this fatal mistake will set up the themes of loss and regret, starting with the Burtons. Corda is also supposedly immortal, and she manages to break through the BSAA perimeter due to her connection with TerraSave's Claire Redfield, and somehow she manages to get a hold of the C virus from Resident Evil 6. From here, we use the excuse that Corda still possesses the proficient mind of Alex Wesker. She's able to synthesize a variation of the C virus that doesn't diminish the brain, alongside a new incubating process from Jake Mueller's blood to speed up the process. From here, Albert Wesker, a man who was long thought dead, is recreated from Corda's efforts and is given the same immortality virus to sustain his DNA. Together, Corda and Wesker's new clone decimate BSAA forces, along with creating another outbreak that also succeeds in Texas, publicly announcing they are unstoppable due to their immortal blood. At this point, it is now up to the remaining heroes to try to put a stop to Corda's plans before the entire planet suffers a global infection, which is slowly but surely turning into a reality in the United States. Considering how serious this situation is becoming, it should be all hands on deck. I believe the story should be interspersed with multiple characters like Billy Cohen, Carlos Oliveira, Jill Valentine, Claire Redfield, Hunk, Ada Wong, Barry Burton, and many others, in particular segments that serve as an epilogue to veterans of the series. I also think this would be a perfect time for Capcom to bring back people who weren't so heroic, like Nikolai for example, and explain how slowly but surely Blue Umbrella can be just as corruptible as the previous Umbrella counterparts before it. Think of Avengers Infinity War, where multiple things are going on behind one centralized event, and the highlight of the show is the return of Albert Wesker. The two main heroes that should have the most screen time within Resident Evil 8 should be an older Leon S. Kennedy and Chris Redfield working together with the branches of the DSO and BSAA respectively, finally breaking barriers as they assist each other with resources and intel. A lot of people might be absolutely tired with Chris and Leon stories, however I think it should feel different. This time around, there should be an aura of finality with these characters that we've all grown up with to appreciate over the years. I do believe that the stakes should be as high as ever, considering that there are a vast sum of these characters that I believe should die in Resident Evil 8. There was an interesting concept floating about with Resident Evil 3.5 where Leon supposedly gets infected and Chris Redfield comes in at the last minute to end his life. Capcom really needs to revisit those threads to make me feel something again about these characters I knew for so long. These threats of death also returned when Capcom originally stated that it was going to be Chris Redfield at first who sacrifices himself for Pierce Nevins in Resident Evil 6.
So when developing the game and the story, we're trying to figure out, well, if we do kill a character, could we kill someone like Chris? And originally we developed a thread where Chris could die in the game, but at the end we decided to not go for that, just because we couldn't think of a good way to do it. It just felt like we were just trying to do something cheap, like just for the shock value. Let's kill a main character here, and that's all it would have been, and it would have been kind of a waste to use Chris's death in that kind of way. So by switching the death over to Piers, the young member of the BSAA, the young, wide-eyed member who's trying to do good and stuff, and when he dies, that has an emotional impact, and so players can put themselves in Chris's shoes, and at that moment they can have some of the similar thought processes as Chris.
Don't be afraid to take risks anymore. For the final entry, all bets should be off. There should be no turning back. I feel what the series has been lacking with the current slew of superhero protagonists has been a palpable sense of urgency, an intensity that tosses the usual Resident Evil formula out of the window. With the return of Wesker, he should be more formidable than he ever was before, especially considering that he has the immortality virus in his blood now. Right off the bat, I don't believe this game should harken back to first-person view mode. I also think that fixed camera angles and tank controls are a thing of the past. Resident Evil 8 should be third person, hear me out. I'm not saying that I want another over-the-top game where you can suplex the living fuck out of Ganados. I think action is inevitable in some parts of Resident Evil. It has its moments, but I think stylistically speaking, to avoid disorientation with a large setup like this, in first person is going to be a bit jarring. Resident Evil 4 controlled the best, therefore, to me, this scheme makes sense. It should be a third-person game, but it should be third-person horror. It should have lingering senses of dread. It should have all the survival horror mechanics that the series has been known for the past few years. So believe me, before that reinvention of Resident Evil 4, I believe this game should have no ammo drops, no quick time events, no gimmicky story co-op to make this game easier. Resident Evil 8 should be a refinement of everything we've come to love from the previous entries and make it a little bit more modernized. It should be an amalgamation that walks a fine line between feeling modernized with the controls and still bringing the pulse-pounding horror that we've come to love and enjoy. Think of the Dead Space series. Dead Space was great as a third-person horror game, and I think if Resident Evil 8 harkened back to this and invited all of these features, it would give Dead Space a run for its money. I would say the thematics of an 8th and final Resident Evil entry should be about loss and sacrifice. What are the effects of said losses? What are the effects of said sacrifices against two unstoppable foes that cannot be touched? What happens when an outbreak is actually successful and cannot be contained in the United States? I think that breaks Resident Evil conventions because the good guys always wins in Resident Evil games. What happens when Wesker is actually unstoppable as far as stakes go? How much are the heroes willing to sacrifice to stop him? I think that should be the most important thing of the conflict. For the final part of miscellaneous concepts, there are these ideas that they could reintroduce into Resident Evil 8 that was cut via previous games. If the setting is in a Midwestern town, perhaps there could be a segment where you could revisit the Arcade Mansion via the same similar concept that they had in Biohazard Dash, although it would be abridged and altered to where you could obviously be in a hazmat suit to protect yourself from anything airborne or nuclear. I think that the vibe of this game should be very similar in tone to Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, where age is finally starting to catch up to Leon and Chris Redfield. A sense of hopelessness is also at the end of the tunnel, and I think that should be introduced as well. I also think that if a mutated Leon is killed by Chris, there should be at least a conflict between Chris and Ada before it happens, harkening back to Resident Evil 6 a little bit. I think that if Wesker is revived, there should be an encounter between Jake Mueller and Albert Wesker. If all the characters in Resident Evil are going to be in this game, that should not be excluded. Not to mention that I would also like to see what Hunk would do in his everyday life before an outbreak spirals out of control around him. I want to see Hunk put into a situation where he's completely unprepared, he's completely unarmed. That would be the ultimate test for Mr. Death. Mercenaries mode, let's bring up Mercenaries mode. So I think that should be as robust as it's ever been. Universally, there should be every single Resident Evil character added in, from the Albinoid to the damn janitor, you know? It should be every single character in the mythos playable here, at least all the human characters. It should also be interchangeable loadouts as well, because we saw this feature in Resident Evil The Mercenaries, and I thought it was pretty cool. So what if I want Krauser's loadout for Wesker? What if I want Chris's loadout for Leon? Those options should be available on the table. Given that I mentioned Infinity War, it creates a narrative. Without spoiling the movie, I want to say that Thanos is definitely the main character. He's the guy who the movie is set up around. So what if we had this idea of Wesker and Corda actually succeeding? I want to say probably yes and no. I think this game should introduce the idea that this is the most damage done in the Resident Evil mythos to date. I think that when it comes to the damage done in the United States, that should be a big deal, because we are bordering now between post-apocalyptic territory, which the Resident Evil series itself, as far as main video game canon, hasn't gone into post-apocalyptic, but the movies have. Not talking about the CGI films, those are great. I'm talking about the shitty live action ones. Just imagine a Resident Evil world where there's devastating effects from the BOWs lingering around too long. Effects on the environment, the air, the population, etc. That would be pretty crazy, man. I also think that maybe the heroes will finally get their hands on another citywide laser and wipe out the villains. Who knows? When they say immortal, they have to specify, like, what's the problem here? Can the body be entirely destroyed? Can the head be destroyed, etc.? It's like this immortality virus has not been explored upon at all. All we know is that there's one character who supposedly has it right now, which is, of course, the little girl in Resident Evil Revelations 2. But yeah, maybe they could snag a citywide laser like they did during the terror. It's so hard to say this word. I don't know how to say it. The Terra Grigia panic. Yeah, Terra Grigia. It's so weird to say, but it was in Resident Evil Revelations 1, and that's how the city got destroyed during that whole scenario. It's weird. I also believe there should be optional co-op missions in Resident Evil 8, but they should have nothing to do with the main story. For the best comparison, I'll use Uncharted's co-op adventure that you could find in Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3's co-op section. Co-op adventure usually involves either killing bosses, killing all the enemies in the area, grabbing an artifact, doing something, etc. So imagine applying a lot of stuff that happened in the Resident Evil mythos that you could do, like grabbing a virus, or maybe killing all the zombies in the area, or fighting a particular enemy, fighting a tyrant. I think that could be applied to a non-canon co-op scenario. Maybe think of something like, well, I think For Survivor is canon, but think of something like that, except it's a huge co-op section. I think this is a good way to harken back to using co-op without interfering with the single player content. I would love if Wesker created a C-Virus clone of Steve Burnside. Now, Steve's dead, but that's the point. Wesker is pitting this creature against Claire again to a fight to the death, which harkens back again to Code Veronica. It would also bring up another remorseful scene of her having to kill him to progress, but not without Claire probably being fatally wounded. Last but not least, I think there should be a section where a character is maybe malnourished, maybe the intense light gets to them. I think that would be something great for a Kijuju Africa outbreak segment. Maybe that will be a mini section with Sheva Alomar. I'm just throwing ideas out there at this point since this is miscellaneous. But this is the end of my video. It's been extensive. It's been long. I enjoyed making it. I hope you guys were thoroughly entertained by everything that I want in Resident Evil 8. It's been quite a trip. My name is Renegade Operative. I will see you guys for the next one, and you take care. Remember, like, subscribe, share, tell your friends, comment. Let's have a blast in the fucking comments. I'll see you guys next time. Later.